Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters. Welcome, Professor Sharma, on our show. Today, you are going to talk about what was Mahatma Gandhi trying to achieve. I'm very excited to be here with you today, and I think our viewers too, in order to learn about Gandhi and his incredible legacy. Welcome, Professor Sharma.
Thank you.
So, can you first and foremost lay out to us what Mahatma Gandhi's goal was, and do you think his goal can be described as for today, as almost fulfilled? What do you think if you look at contemporary times?
Yeah, that's a very good setting for the question. So the question is, what was Mahatma Gandhi trying to achieve? Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have questions at the end of that. And in that half hour, what I'd like to accomplish is basically to suggest various goals which one could apparently find as goals set by Mahatma Gandhi for himself, like the achievement of Indian independence, like the abolition of untouchability, and so on, or removal of injustices against women, and so on. And then I would try from that to describe my own perception of what he was really trying to achieve. And once I have done that, we can have questions querying what I have said. Okay, so when we look at the checkered life of Mahatma Gandhi, we can suggest several goals which he was trying to achieve. For instance, in India, Mahatma Gandhi is usually revered as the person who brought us independence. He entered the political scene in India around 1920, after his return from South Africa. He launched a major movement against the British in the early 1920s, then again in the early 1930s, and then in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War. And finally, the British left in 1947. The last British Viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten, openly declared Mahatma Gandhi to be the architect of India's independence. There are popular songs in India which compliment Mahatma Gandhi for having helped us achieve independence, and also without firing a bullet. A very popular song says that saint from Sabarmati is the name of a river in India, where he had one of his ashrams or hermitages. That saint of Sabarmati, who brought us independence without a shield and without a sword. That is, without fighting for it violently. And this is how he is depicted in many history books. So, one very plausible achievement of Mahatma Gandhi, what was he trying to accomplish? He was trying to achieve India's independence. And without doubt, this has certain persuasive power, this particular line of logic. But the point I want to make is a statement by Mahatma Gandhi that if India's independence was to be achieved by violent means, he has no interest in it. In other words, his main goal was not the achievement of India's independence. His main goal was the achievement of India's independence by non-violent means. To such an extent that I think it was around 1934 that he resigned from the membership of the very organization which he had really converted into a mass movement, into the vanguard of a mass movement, the Congress Party, the Indian National Congress as it was formally called. He resigned from the membership on the ground that he now realizes that people accepted his goal of non-violent struggle against the British, not on principle, but as expedient. What did he mean by that? Indians realized that the British have the greatest empire in the world. They have a British army, which has a stellar record of success. The British had disarmed India, so there was no hope of driving the British away by using violent means. And therefore they accepted Mahatma Gandhi's policy of non-violence. This disappointed Mahatma Gandhi because he wanted his policies to be accepted in principle and not on the basis of expediency. So he wasn't a formal member of the Congress after that. So what I'm trying to say is that he wanted to achieve Indian independence yet, but only the non-violent means. Then you might say that another great achievement of Mahatma Gandhi was the abolition of untouchability. What was untouchability? It was a practice in India which segregated a section of society from the rest of society because they pursued a profession which the rest of the society considered impure. Dealing with dead animals, scavenging, disposal of human, what is called night soil in India, or human excreta, etc. And people thought that touching them or eating food touched by them would pollute them. So they were kept segregated. Mahatma Gandhi insisted they are human beings as other human beings. And therefore, this practice should be abolished. Now, in this, just as his move for achieving independence was opposed by the British and some Indians even, his move to abolish untouchability was opposed by an untouchability leader, the leader of the untouchables, rather I should say, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar wanted to use legislation and political processes to achieve this goal. Gandhi felt that politics is a form of coercion. After all, a government is the sole authority in a society which reserves the right to coerce people by passing laws. So Gandhi was opposed to these means of achieving it. He wanted a transformation of heart on the part of the Hindus who discriminated against the untouchables. That is, non-violent means. So even a cause so dear to his heart as the abolition of untouchability, he wanted it to be brought about. He even risked his life for it, but by non-violent means. And we will find this if we turn to other achievements of Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was a great emancipator of women. People often don't realize this because you also idealize their role as mother and as housekeeper. His language was not feminist in the modern sense, but the results were. When he launched his famous Salt March, in which in the end 80,000 people were imprisoned, 18,000 of them were women. 17,000 were arrested on the first day. So a person who can bring women traditionally confined to the household in a public protest like this has achieved, from the point of view of observers of the Indian scene, almost a miracle. But how did he do it? Not by being strident, not by giving a battle cry, but by actually doing things which resulted in this transformation, empowering women. So whichever achievement of his we will turn to, we will find that it was rooted in nonviolence. So now I come to the second part of my presentation. Why was Gandhi so insistent on nonviolence? This is the question we have to ask and answer. To get an answer to our question, what made him tick? Now, in order for us to understand what Gandhi was trying to achieve, in my view, we will have to digress here. And the digression might appear initially almost irrelevant to my talk. So I would just say to the audience, please bear with me. We will discover its relevance before too long. I would like to begin by asking a question. Suppose you are sitting in your home in Montreal with your family and children, wife and children, that is with your family. Somebody bursts into the room and shoots down your children. Some terrorist. Somehow you manage to gain control over him, subdue him. What will you do next? And you even have weapons in your room. What I'm trying to say is, he has killed your children. You are now in complete control over his future at the moment, whether he lives or dies. He has been subdued, and you have the weapons to kill him. This is the situation. What will you do as a citizen of Canada or Quebec or Montreal? I've asked this question in several fora. And in the end, the majority, if not everybody, agrees that they will call the police and hand him over to the police. Now, my question at this point is, why? Is it not quite apparent that he has just killed your children? What more proof do you need? You have the weapons. You have the criminal. You have the motivation. You can say either that you are going to do justice to the situation or that you are getting your revenge. I would just like to add here that according to Gandhi, to seek revenge is to become unjust in the pursuit of justice. So just let's talk about justice. Why don't you kill him? What could be more logical, rational, ethical, legal But you won't? Why? Because, well, before I say that, why? Please imagine the degree of socialization we have undergone. That's such an instinctive reaction to kill the intruder when it is fully justified. Is prevented from coming into operation by our socialization. And we call the police and hand him over. Why? Because humanity has learned the hard way that it is better to live in a society characterized by law and order than in a society suffering from the chaos of revenge taking. And that is why we have been socialized in this way. I'm going to thicken the plot now. Suppose he is in the custody of the police, but he is able to make an escape. Will you not feel cheated? Will you not feel now justified in tracking him down and shooting him dead? No. Even then you will not do it. Just please consider this. And let me thicken it further. Suppose he is let off by the court because of some legal technicality. I don't know what they are called in Canada, but in America at one time they had something called the Miranda rights. Any accused had to be told that he has these rights, that he has the right to a lawyer, not to disclose anything which will incriminate him to the police, and so on. And if these rights had not been read out to him, the case could not proceed. Suppose on this technicality, the murderer of your children is let off. Will you still kill him? Even then you will not kill him, because you have realized that it is better to live in a society characterized by law and order, even with occasional lapses from justice, than to live in a society characterized by the chaos of private revenge seeking. Right? Now, I suggest to you that what Mahatma Gandhi was trying to tell us was this. When it comes to resolving issues through due process, well, before I say anything else, actually, let me just point out to you that according to Gandhi, you have been acting non-violently. When you decided, you were acting non-violently when you decided not to shoot him and hand him over to the police. So we have learned to resolve our conflicts non-violently at the individual level, within a society or a nation. What we need to do, the lesson we need to learn, is to resolve differences at the national level or within a society between major sections of society like labor and capitalists in the same way. We'll have to just backtrack a bit. See the gains of living in a society characterized by law and order. What all is made possible our arts, our science, our social organization, our political system. All this is based on that non-violence. I don't want to run down any country, but the difficulties Afghanistan is having in emerging as a settled, calm society may have something to do with the strong tradition it has of revenge taking between tribes. So what Mahatma Gandhi was trying to tell us was that just as the first generation, which decided not to kill the intruder, but to hand him over to the police, had to carry out an act of faith, and I'll explain this in a minute, we also have to carry out an act of faith when it comes to nations. What do I mean by that? This is a society in which everybody has been killing their enemies, right? The intruder comes, you are about ready to kill him, but you realize that there is a leader in your society who has been suggesting that people should not kill each other. They should start legal cases. So you respect this person enough to think that maybe I should try this. So he says, okay, I won't kill him. I'm going to hand him over to the authorities. Now imagine if he escapes. If the accused escapes, won't you feel cheated? I tried to do this and this is what happened to me. And if he is let off, you will feel cheated. At that point, you have to realize your historic role. You'll have to bear this as the price the pioneer has to pay. So it is quite possible that the first people who are trying to introduce non-violent resolution of cases might be people who lose out or run the danger of losing out. But they must have to have the faith of the first generation that what we are doing will produce such beneficial effects in the long run that our sacrifice is worth it. I mean, just imagine. Introducing law and order made civilization possible. Can we imagine that if we learn to resolve our issues through non-violent means, what is possible? To increase the credibility of my suggestion, let me take a hypothetical case with which I will conclude. Let us suppose Germany and England, eve of the Second World War, decided that, okay, we have very strong differences, but we will resolve them non-violently. We will accept arbitration by a third party. We won't go to war. Let us have three scenarios now. That the third party, the arbiter, gave a judgment which many people thought was in favor of Britain. Case one. Case two. It gave a judgment which many people thought was favorable to Germany. Case three. It gave a judgment which people thought was evenly balanced. So in the third case, there is not much of a problem. Both sides are satisfied that we probably did the right thing. But I want to turn to case one and case two. What happened as a result of the Second World War? Germany was devastated. The ratio of the sex ratio in Germany was horrible because all the young men died, and so on. I don't have to pile up the agony. What happened in Germany? Whole cities bombed out. What happened in Britain? It won, but rationing. The number of deaths in the war is said to be 50 million. Half of the dead were on the Allied side, on a rough calculation. What I'm trying to say is that England, and more, and particularly important, Britain lost the empire. If Hitler set out with the goal of conquering England, he failed. But if his goal was to destroy the British Empire, he succeeded. What I'm trying to say is that howsoever adverse the judgment may have been for England, it would not have been as badly off as it was at the end of the Second World War. And howsoever adverse the judgment may have been for Germany, it would not have been as badly off as it was at the end of the Second World War. And I think this is what the Mahatma was trying to achieve.
You mentioned transformation of heart. Now, this seems to be key. Now, one could argue that this has been a very particular case, and Mahatma Gandhi has been a very particular, extraordinary person. How would you say this and his political stance of nonviolence would or can be applied in today's current political climate, whether this is in North America or in other parts of the world?
This is a very good question. Let us look at some of these more absurd suggestions from our commonsensical point of view. That the Jews should allow themselves to be killed by Hitler. That the Hindus should allow themselves to be killed by the Muslims in the riots. Isn't it absurd? But when Gandhi was told this, he said, they will leave behind an imperishable example. Now, the position opposite to Mahatma Gandhi was taken by Golda Meir of Israel, when she said, I will not allow Israel to be destroyed so that the world may speak well of it. So you see, we see what the stakes are. But what Gandhi is saying is that even if in one case, through our sacrifices, we can demonstrate to the world the actual benefits of resolving such a conflict non-violently, its appeal would seem so natural. Suppose somehow, by some stroke, the Palestinians and the Jews managed to strike a deal non-violently. Do you think Hindus and Muslims can go on fighting? Or India or Pakistan can go on fighting? When they will say both of them flourishing, Israel and Palestine side by side. Why don't we also do this? The whole world will change. Actually, I have no doubt about this. The benefits will be so obvious. And so it is worth the risk. If the guy had said, no, I'm going to kill the guy, the first man who decided to allow the intruder to be handed over to the police. If his nerve had failed, you would never be able to see the benefits And remember, in his case, two families will benefit, his own and that of the accused. They won't lose a person, yeah, if he's not killed in revenge, and so on. Though he could, of course, be sentenced to death, so there's another issue. The benefits will be so obvious. If you can, once you can achieve. Look at the case of India and Britain. The relationships between India and Britain as they are now would have been impossible if it had been a military struggle to the kind of difficulties Algeria and France had for so long. You remember that? So it's a revolutionary shift in a paradigm of problem solving. The thing to keep in mind is that the apparent loser will lose less than otherwise.
Now, if we will leave out politics, I think everyone would subscribe to this proposition that Gandhi put forward. It's an incredible, inspiring story. What would you see and how do you separate spirituality and religion from what Gandhi did? Now, from these two perspectives. And would you separate the two, spirituality and religion? And if so,
Well,
how?
Let's see. Let's look at what the basic psychology, human psychology, which Gandhi is working on. Gandhi's basic idea was that in order to transform somebody's heart, you must be ready to undergo voluntary suffering. I'll give you an almost crude example, or you might even consider it trivial, but I'm a professor. If a young lady comes to me and says, I need an extension because I've had these problems and all that. That is one young girl comes to me and says, I will start discussing it with her. What were the problems? Don't you think you should reconsider? So on. A second young lady comes in and bursts into tears about some trouble she has been having. What would be my reaction? Different, right? Why? The language of suffering is more eloquent than words. She has displayed suffering. She's crying. You can call it voluntary suffering, crying on her own, right? She's subjecting herself to suffering. And that has transformed my attitude. Gandhi believed that every human being was human enough that at some point, this dialectic will come into play. So your voluntary suffering, the extent to which you are prepared to undergo voluntary suffering, is your test. And you should be prepared to die for it also. Gandhi was not so naive that he thought people will roll over. Right? He knew that when long-standing vested interests are at stake, people will resist. There will be conflict. Blood will be shed. The only question Gandhi asked was, whose blood should it be? Should it rather not be your blood as the more mature side to the conflict? than the other person. Through your voluntary suffering, you have set out to transform the heart of the other party. Now, this was an act or a matter of faith for Gandhi, that every human being is a human being. So at some point, your voluntary suffering is going to activate his humanity, his or her humanity. And that is why I was prepared to die. Now you call it spirituality, you call it morality, call it human psychology, call it political shrewdness. You see, this is a very tricky thing. Once, one of his disciples, this happened in, I think, 1946, somewhere around that time, the Muslim girl, Attu Salam, even her name is known. She went with him in a region where Hindus and Muslims had been at each other forever. And it was a Muslim majority area. So Gandhi followers fanned out in the various villages. She ended up in a village which was Muslim majority. There was a Hindu minority, and they had a temple of the goddess. And there are two swords, decorative swords hung on the walls. And in the disturbances, they had been removed by the Muslims. So this young lady, Amtu Salam, said, should live in peace. Hindus and Muslims should live in peace. Same God, two religions, but preach the same thing. So why don't you return those two as a gesture of goodwill? They said, no, who are you? They behaved in a manner towards her which we would regard as high-handed and arrogant. So she kept listening to them. Then finally she said, if you don't accept my request, then I'll stop taking food. They said, you can do whatever you like. Then she said, if you won't respond to my request, then I'll stop taking water. Again, they said, do whatever. So she lay down on a cot in front of the mosque. Message flashed to Gandhi. This is what has happened. Gandhi sent her a note. The note said, drink water. Give God time to work his miracle. So she started drinking water. On the fourth day, the entire village was prostrate before her, willing to do anything she said. This is the Gandhian technique. You undergo voluntary suffering, there's a change of heart, there is a genuine resolution of the issue. Nobody has won, nobody has lost. Both sides are transformed. It's a very profound message.
You mentioned very eloquently how the socialization process went on if you look back, and your illustration is really important to see how struggles actually will ultimately play out and pay out for the common good. How would you answer to questions of socialization that we still suffer tremendous wars, like just the Israel-Palestine conflict, and how can we help as individuals to actually forge this process in order to achieve what Gandhi always tried to achieve, that was to change society and hearts in a non-violent way.
But we have to reflect on our earlier example of how have we been socialized not to take revenge. We are told throughout our life at school about law and order, civic duties. Yeah. We are familiarized with the institution of the police. We meet policemen. So that our whole thinking is shaped in that way. And that is, yeah. And so, the education is the secret, how we educate the people. If we tell them, look, there will be differences. People will cheat, but make a court case, don't stab the guy. Even if he has robbed you of your entire life savings, take him to court. Right? So this is how we are socialized, and we have specialists in law. So we'll have to train people, specialize in non-violent resolution. And the educators then, just as the senior generation has realized that no matter how grave, how justified, how profound your reason for revenge is, you cannot take it. Court. Similarly, no matter for how many years one country has exploited another country, or ruled over another country, or one section of society has made life hell for another section of society, the one thing you cannot do is seek a violent resolution. See, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa is the real way of following upon Gandhi. And it disclosed us a further detail of the Gandhian dialectic. And what was that detail? There were 4 policemen white policemen, who openly confessed in a gathering of blacks that they had killed black protesters, or black prisoners, sorry. They openly confessed and cried. Now, what happens when that happens is that the victim suddenly starts feeling that I'm also a human being. So he's being human, right? He did this, he's repentant, he's crying. I'm also a fallible human being. I may have a genuine grievance, but I know that human beings can genuinely go wrong. So I should be forgiving. You'll be amazed how often when people complain of, how others have treated them and so on, the apology, the confession, the admission diffuses the situation. Because of this, the dynamic shifts. And there might be an apology, or there might be even some compensation, but the whole manner in which that is being resolved changes the complexion of the case. And you asked about spirituality and all that. The person who described this scene in South Africa ended this whole incident, this his report on the incident, with the last line, God was in that room. If you want to be very rational about it, these are totally human processes, right? The way we discuss them, human psychology, human responses, and so on. So maybe in that sense, there is no God. But there's a transcendence of the existing situation. And in as much as religion is a celebration of transcendence, it becomes a religious or spiritual occasion.
I think this is so interesting because I think there seems also a gap between the individual and the collective. And so
Exactly.
to engineer it, not engineering, but to solve the problem like at the individual level, it might be possible. But then you have also this whole dynamic when groups come into play. And then we also know from there that people change behavior based on the situation. And so then it becomes very complicated to actually implement what Gandhi also said, even though one might be conscious about the consequences that I shall not take revenge, for example. How do you respond to this, that it is, or it can be extremely tricky, especially if there are more people involved?
But, sir, if panic can spread, courage can also be contagious. You remember the name of Aquino, the Philippine leader in the age of Marcos? This comment has been attributed to him, I think. In any case, he was killed on his arrival in Philippines. When he came to fight in the election, he was a rival of Marcos, and he knew he would be killed. Sort of, he feared or anticipated. But he came, he was killed. What happened? Marcos lost to Mrs. Aquino. You see? No violent revolution, but regime change.
Now, we are almost at the end. You said an act of faith, and it seems, especially in our contemporary world, we lose more and more faith in history or in historical processes, because if you look at history in retrospect, we clearly see how fruitful so many actions were of people such as Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so on. What would you suggest to people today, especially also young people, how to challenge regimes and problems that we face, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere?
You see, if we get bogged down in history, then we will never get out of it. Let's go back to the case of the intruder who kills your children. If you keep agonizing over the death of your children, the new vision which you have of resolution of interpersonal disputes, will have great difficulty in emerging. That is why people accuse Gandhi of lacking a sense of history. But now you see what he was saying. He was saying the problem with our history is that if there are two brothers and they have great differences and they resolve them peacefully, they will never go down in history. But they killed each other, there will be a chapter in the history book.
That's a very interesting point. Absolutely. Now, obviously, it's also very dangerous at times that if we forget history, obviously, that's not your point. I think, obviously, it's about reconciliation, as you just mentioned, how important it is and how important it is to really move forward into a more peaceful area of our times. Now, to conclude, could you give us your favorite author or book and your wishes for the future, within Gandhi's thought?
You will forgive an element of self-promotion in what I'm going to say, okay? But the first book I would recommend to people who want to really know more about Gandhi is Louis Fisher's The Life of Mahatma Gandhi. It's an old classic. Those who are interested in my interpretation of Gandhi might wish to read my own book, Gandhi, a Spiritual Biography, in which I spell this all out.
And the last word, what you can give us that we ought to take from Gandhi in 2 or 3 sentences?
Well, there's a famous line, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind.
Professor Arvind Sharma, it has been a blessing to have you on our show. Thank you so much.
It has been a privilege for me to be on your show. Thank you.
Arvind Sharma. And just as an aside, please check out his books. He is one of the foremost scholars in the field and highly, highly recommended. Thank you so much.
Bye.